I'm here today with Crystal, a data scientist at Asana. Thank you so much for coming right after the basketball game.
Yeah, no problem. Hopefully I'm not too sweaty on camera.
Just curious, how do you get so many rebounds? Is there data science involved?
No data science involved, unfortunately. I guess I can attribute that one to a decent vertical and disproportionately long arms.
Do you feel like you know how someone's going to miss based on their past performance?
No, but I'd have to watch them quite a bit in order to be able to assess that with data science.
What the heck is data science?
Data science as a concept, I think, is really just trying to get valuable information using data. And there's two classes of problems that people try to answer. One is they try to predict the future based on patterns in the data that they've seen in the past. And the other is that they try to actually understand what those patterns even are in the data. Using like a real world example, say you were trick-or-treating and you were really interested in knowing what houses would have the candy that you would most want so that you could go to those houses. You could use your past experiences of going to those houses and knowing what candies they have to make an educated guess around what candies they might have in the next year. But you could also use certain attributes of the house or things that you notice. Like if the house has Halloween decorations up, does that mean it's more likely that you'll get good candy there? Or what neighborhood is that house in? These are all kinds of things that you might consider in the class of like trying to understand how Halloween candy is even distributed. If you're interested in knowing, just being able to predict what candy you would get, that's one set of problems. And if you are interested in knowing like what is the most helpful in predicting what candy you get, that's another class of problems. And yeah, I think overall it's just kind of like a either predicting the future or understanding the past. And that's what data science is used for.
Would you say understanding the past comes first before predicting the future?
They're almost two entirely different problems. Obviously, understanding the past is helpful in predicting the future, but the kinds of tools that you use if you cared about one versus the other would be very different. Like there's a lot of machine learning classifiers out there that are very good at predicting the future, but not very easy for humans to understand what they're basing their predictions on.
Got it. Who would you say are the main stakeholders that you work with? How does like a data science project get kicked off? Is it initiated by the data science team, the product manager? How does that work?
I would say that most of my work is usually in response to a particular question that someone has on a product team, maybe specifically product managers, just because they are the people who will ultimately be using this information to drive product direction. And so any question that I answer is only as useful as it is useful to the people who are making decisions with it.
So how much of your work would be getting clean data sets versus like analyzing the data versus it sounds like you have to present your findings? What's the breakdown?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Sometimes it's very little cleaning of data or very little thinking about how I'm acquiring the data. Sometimes we've already thought of that, we've thrown it into a table and it's really easy to access. Sometimes it's much more difficult and that part takes a lot longer, just thinking about like, oh, what logs do I have to go through or what even needs to be recorded in the first place? Like, who do I need to reach out to get the data that we need to answer this question? Analysis is still a good chunk of it. That's what I think data scientists are ultimately paid to do. But I like to spend a lot of time on the how it's presented to. I think that maybe one of the more parts that I find interesting is just like, okay, well, we have all these numbers that are outputted from this analysis. Like, what does that mean? What can we learn from this? how do I then present it in a way that is easy for people who don't live and breathe data to understand?
I would love to see like a real life application of data science. Say for example, our basketball team, how would you use data science to look at our past performance and help us win more games in the future?
First of all, we have to play a lot more than once a week for any data science to actually help us there. What immediately comes to mind is that this is a classification problem of trying to understand what factors predict winning versus what factors predict losing. So maybe things like how many times we pass the ball before we shoot, or how many turnovers we had, or how many times we went to the line, or how many shots that were 3-pointers versus 2-pointers. All of those I think would be interesting to measure and see how that impacts whether or not we win.
Let's say you have all of this data already at your disposal. The games that we won, you have all the stats. The games that we lost, you have all the stats. How would you play with that data?
Yeah, I think I'd start out with just plotting everything and seeing like, okay, visually, what predicts us winning versus losing? And that kind of gives you a good idea of like what features are probably worth thinking about how you transform them in a way by the statistical models to like accurately determine if they are of statistical importance or not, and which ones you can probably just ignore later on and not think too much about how you're going to construct various features out of them. I think the next thing is understanding how those features relate to each other. If you were to look at raw stats like number of 2-point shots made, that is related to the number of 2-point shot attempts and also related to the 2-point shot percentages made, right? Depending on the model that you use, it is not great to include all of those types of related features together because that throws off the assumptions around what you're feeding into the model and will give you incorrect results a lot of the time from a like statistical perspective. So understanding how different pieces of the data that you have are related to each other and different from each other is useful in making sure that you are having a statistically rigorous definition of what is important versus not. And after that, you choose a model that you thought was cool and throw it into that model, and you tweak parameters and run it and see how well it performed, see how well it was predicting if you would win or not versus like if you were actually winning or not.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about your data science experience.
Thanks again for having me.